We continually see revisions, reversals, such as on the tariffs and on some areas, but not in others. This is generally seen as novel territory. I mean, many of President Trump's policies are something we have not yet seen in U.S. history, especially since the end of the Cold War. So people are struggling to understand the full impact and consequences and repercussions. And so none of this is certain. We're all trying to give our best assessment with what we have. We also don't have the detailed strategy documents yet. Normally, a new administration will come in and issue a national security strategy, national defense strategy, and so on. In the first term, these documents weren't always what the president followed. So that's another caveat. But at least they gave us a general sense of prioritization and something that the bureaucracy at least would use for guidance. There's also a real novelty in the way this administration is staffing. Many of the people at the senior level are new to those positions. They've never had a background. They're running agencies they never served in or don't seem to have much background in. Very few people from the first term at the highest level, the cabinet members and so on, have come back. So it's difficult to predict how the new people will behave. There's also major changes in much more deeper in the bureaucracy. We're seeing a lot of people being transferred out and new people coming in, and the repercussions of these junior people have yet to be seen. The one thing I would note, though, is that the National Security Council staff, many of those people did serve in the first Trump administration, not always in the position they're in now, but they have had some experience. So I would look to them to provide a overarching framework to guide the rest of the execution by the various cabinet agencies and other institutions. Most of these people either were serving the first administration or some came from industry and Congress. But for the most part, they're more what we expected to see running the key staff positions in the administration. Um, Now, lastly, I have mixed assessments. I'm not really sure of my own views on some of these policies because they are so novel. So I'm really hoping, and I understand from Warren's going to be case, we're going to get a lot of comments as well as questions from people in the audience to help us sort of understand what's happening and what could happen. So thank you. Those are my brief introduction remarks.
So Richard, maybe I'll start with a general question because I think the feeling that I get from a lot of people when I talk to is kind of a um, confusion and a lack of clarity, ambiguity about what is this administration really looking for to achieve? What's the end goal here? So if you can maybe start with what you perceive to be the end goal of the administration in the sense of what do you think is their uh, um, prime strategy goal, which kind of dedicates everything else to follow. What are they really trying to achieve here?
Right. So this is a challenge we're facing because people who worked with President Trump in his first term said it's really incorrect to speak of a Trump doctrine. He doesn't think that way about foreign policy matters. It's much more focused on key goals he's trying to maximize. These include economic gains to the U.S., um, jobs, trade, revisions. Uh, Very much his policy depends a lot on bilateral relations. So with each leader, he tends to focus on different things at different times. Um, there's not a solid commitment to institutions as opposed to personalities. It's mostly personality driven. And we don't have the strategy documents to help us understand this. So you could see that, for example, in Ukraine, the president says we want peace, but that's if you focus on a ceasefire, that's on a way to peace, would be the mineral deal, but it's not yet a comprehensive, enduring peace. It's missing a few things. Same with, and some policies were still, it's really early on. I mean, I'm sure you'll someone else talk about this, but for example, Iran, we anticipated a major effort there, but we really don't know what the end goal is. I mean, President Trump has said he wants to contain the Iranian nuclear program, which is understandable, but there are also some ancillary issues related to, Iranian support for terrorism, Iranian missile programs, and so on, which we haven't got a lot of clarity on. So I'm not sure if we can say what's the end goal they want to leave. The Biden administration, it was somewhat clear they wanted to have, strong alliances with friends, containment of enemies, building of domestic economy, making it a more fair economy, making it a more just society in the US and externally. Um, didn't succeed in some of these objectives, but I think that was somewhat clear from both the documents and President Biden's statements and those of his senior advisors. Here, maybe this will become clear later, but for now, we just don't have that.
How much do you think it is instead of an ideology or I'm sorry, instead of a policy and a doctrine, it's an ideology in the sense that we know the Biden administration was definitely a continuation of a status quo of a world order that is basically founded on institutions such as the UN, NATO, the EU, and relations which are multilateral versus bilateral, a security architecture that perceive great powers as part of a law and order system, and so on. And we see kind of a 180 shift to bilateral great power competition, bilateral arrangements, the old alliances such as NATO, the relations with countries such as France, the UK, and even Canada, to be kind of shaken to the core. So, how much is it an ideology that basically says the old order was not what we can continue? The new normal is a new order in which the United States needs to be the leading force, the leading power, and that's basically the policy versus a doctrine, but an ideology that pushes this policy.
Right. I think that makes sense in a general level. The whole doctrine is America first, so that means American primacy, America above all, do what benefits the U.S. Um, and we talked about the goal of economic maximization. He's taking policies he think will benefit the U.S. economically. A couple other novel, I mean, just in general, does very much see himself as a disruptor of the status quo. That's very clear domestically with what's happening within the U.S. and reversing of many policies through executive orders. But internationally, we're seeing that as well, withdrawing from some institutions, attacks on and key agencies in the U.S. government, um, and the people he put in charge have very much reputations as disruptors, as opposed to establishment figures. But there are a couple variable new goals that are becoming clear. For example, a lot of emphasis on free speech. Which they mean, reducing regulation of what people can say and do in the internet, mostly say what they can say in the internet, trying to encourage, if that's the right verb, and the Europeans to be more open to alternative parties that have popular support. But I agree with you. Overall, the orientation is revisionist and disruptive of the established order as opposed to previous presidents where they tried to reinforce and strengthen that order.
So within that, I think the first point to look at, or the first actor to look at, is the 180 shift when it comes to Russia. I mean, for 3 years, Putin was a pariah. There was no contact. There was definitely no discussion about visiting of a U.S. president in Moscow. And then we see a new administration that essentially is not only engaging Russia when it comes to the talks in Saudi Arabia about the conflict in Ukraine, but also essentially is looking into Russia. Maybe what I heard from some people doing a reverse Nixon as a potential ally when it comes to confronting China in the future, etc. So, what can you tell us about the upcoming, or what we're seeing now is the beginning of a new policy in regards to the U.S. and Russia relations?
Right. So you're right that the Russia policy is more just a Ukraine policy. Ukraine maybe a catalyst to bring Russia and the US into engagement, but the administration has much more far-reaching goals, normalizing relations with Russia, expanding diplomatic ties, looking for business opportunities. What we've seen has been some enticements. They're reversible enticements. So, you can say, okay, NATO, Ukraine won't be in NATO, and we'll certainly try and consider removing sanctions, but you can always put the sanctions back and change your mind about Ukraine and NATO. So they are reversible, but they are a lot of incentives trying to pull Russia into engagement. Now, Moscow has somewhat reciprocated on, saying, okay, yes, we can consider arms control issues and talk about extension of New START, and we certainly want to look at business opportunities. But overall, we're seeing, I think, Russia make the same mistake they did the first time when Trump attempted this. So he tried to make some, enticements to Moscow, but we didn't really see reciprocation, and I think that's going to impede Russia-U.S. cooperation on Ukraine. So we haven't yet seen the Russian government reverse any of its demands, and then overall, despite some of the changes we've seen in U.S. policy, diplomatic engagement, and so on. The Russians said that's great, but now we need you to remove the sanctions, and they haven't, they basically they're pushing for more and more without offering reciprocity. The idea of breaking up the Russia-China, alignment, long discussed. I don't, that may be a goal of the US, and certainly some officials have said that, and not Trump himself, but some of his lower officials have said that that is an objective. That's going to be extremely difficult because the Russians are clearly wholeheartedly committed to their China alliance. China has become their most important economic, political, military, diplomatic partner. President Putin is personally heavily invested in that partnership. That's arguably the only success he's had in foreign policy is strengthening ties with China. There's not a lot of opposition to that within the Russian government. People who say, well, you're becoming overly dependent on China is bad for Russia. Would clearly run into career problems. I mean, that's basically challenging Putin's, basically what he sees as his legacy. Um, Also, I think the Russians are going to discount whatever opportunities they see with the US. They understand that, Trump can only stay in for a few years. There's still a lot of hostility to Russia within the US Congress, among allies. So whatever concessions he might offer or, enticements are going to be reversible by, if not him, then under future administrations. So I just can't see them giving up their great ties with China to gain tenuous benefits with the US. But what I think we might see is the Russians might be more willing to sacrifice Iran or North Korea. They've done that before. So you could see them offering to cut back on ties with Iran, put pressure on Iran and North Korea to roll back their nuclear programs. So I think that might be more possible, more achievable if the relationship improves.
So it's interesting because you're basically describing a situation where we're going to see a diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Russia where there is a lot of linkage, which in the past that wasn't so much how U.S. foreign policy was conducted, but it seems that now it's something that maybe the current administration might actually see as a potential kind of a benefit of having this type of bilateral relations with the Russians. Would that be correct to assume that we're going to see more linkage between I'll give you more in Ukraine, but which is what you said, right? That maybe you'll give me more pressure on Iran there, or do you see that something we can see moving forward with this administration in other situations as well?
Yeah, I mean that linkage is not new in U.S. Russia, U.S. Soviet relations. It goes back to Henry Kissinger trying to say, okay, we'll give you, a New START arms control agreement, but then you help us out on Vietnam. And so this is, I think that's certainly plausible. You're going to run up a problem that there's not a lot the Russians can offer in some areas. So economically, the U.S. Russian economic relations have always been minimal, even in the best of times. So I can't really see that relationship develop. I think we're just going to fall back on the areas we've been able to cooperate on in the last 50 years, which is arms control, non-proliferation, perhaps regional security issues. I don't know if the administration wants to get Russia's help in the Middle East as beyond Iran. I don't know, East Asia, there's certainly a lot of hot spots there, Afghanistan and others that we may be able to cooperate on. Um, I think what they are trying to do, though, is de-link Ukraine from some of this. So they don't want to say, well, if we can't reach an agreement on Ukraine, then we can't do any of these other things. I think they might be willing to say, okay, we're at a stalemate in Ukraine, but still we should cooperate on, Arctic, Iran, um, Israel, Palestine, something like that.
So let's touch on that topic of Ukraine. There's so much that happened in the last 2 months, almost incredible. I think most people are currently looking at the Zelensky-Trump meeting that happened on the weekend, but even before that, in the Munich conference, and we just had a webinar about the German elections. A lot of people were shocked by the comments that were made by U.S. Vice President Vance. And in a sense, for a lot of people, it was not just a 180 on the conflict itself, i.e., on the U.S. engagement towards the conflict, from supporting the Ukrainians in their war towards reaching a quick settlement, but also on the whole idea of the Europeans and NATO as an alliance in general. So taking that kind of context into it and putting, of course, the scene we saw on the weekend, where do we stand right now when it comes to U.S.-Ukrainian relations? Because it really seems as if it's on something between on the verge of basically complete cutoff to something that is being fixed and a part of a tough negotiations. So where do you see this negotiation? Where do you see these relationships at the moment?
Right. So the pressure they've been putting on Ukraine, just like the enticements they've been offering Russia, are reversible. So aid cutoffs, denouncing Zelensky as a dictator, demanding mineral rights, and so on. All of those are something that they can reverse if they need to. Uh, for now, it looks like the coercion has been tactical in the sense of trying to force the Ukrainian government to sign this mineral deal, which has dubious long-term economic prospects, which we can get into if we need to, but also to get the Ukrainians to moderate their demands for security assurances, peace deal, and so on. But there is a general perception that President Trump, and especially Vice President Vance, is not seeing Ukraine as an ally or partner. They're seeing it just as a party to a conflict with Russia that they're trying to solve. So it's not really a privileged partner anymore. And so you can take these kind of steps to confront the Ukrainians and sort of force them into agreement with Russia that, the Ukrainians might not want. Um, with respect to, US and NATO, we haven't seen the worst outcomes come. There was some speculation that they would follow Musk's proposal just to consider NATO obsolete and get out of that. We haven't seen that yet. We have seen demands for more NATO defense spending, President Trump's preference for dealing with European leaders bilaterally, not collectively. So he's happy to meet with the British and French leaders here in the White House, and meetings apparently went well, as opposed to engaging NATO collectively. He's not obviously very committed to alliances in principle, but I think he doesn't see a reason to disengage, to dissolve NATO or leave it. But he certainly might devolve responsibility for European security more to NATO, so that he can either focus on countering immigration or China or what have you. But it has been, from the European perspective, you said, beginning with that speech, a bit of shock and awe, a campaign that the Europeans are struggling to respond to because there are divisions within the Europeans. There, they don't really want to give up on, their economic benefits and pay a lot more for defense, given the sacrifice. So they're still, I think, hoping that they can repair relations with the U.S.
So I like the idea of a kind of a shock and awe diplomacy as a start, yeah, because it's really was a shock and awe for many. That Munich speech, obviously Zelensky and Trump meeting was maybe the peak, but that's not where it started. It started, and I'm talking about when the administration took office, not before, which even before was way down the hill. So on that relations, it seems the U.S. entered those negotiations with Russia, and I'm calling them negotiations because they're talking. One, they're doing it in Saudi Arabia. And in those negotiations in Saudi Arabia, it seems that one, they basically said there will be no U.S. troops in Ukraine as part of a tripwire mechanism like we have in Korea or in Japan, for example. There will be no NATO alliance membership for Ukraine, which is something that basically was one of the things that were discussed about as a way to kind of promise security guarantees for the Ukrainians. And that was given away as a statement, not even as part of the negotiation, but as a starting point for the US before even the negotiation started. So the idea here, or the question here is, where is the US when it comes to Ukraine in the negotiations? What is it that they're willing to do for the Ukrainians? I mean, I understand where they're coming from in terms of the Russians and getting the Russians on board, but what are they willing to do to get the Ukrainians on board, except using the stick, not the carrot? So, what are the carrots? Maybe that's the question.
Right. They focused a lot on this economic, the mineral deal, building strong economic ties. But we know that it alone isn't really a security guarantee. Saddam Hussein was happy to invade Kuwait despite all the US and Western oil companies there, and was happy to grab the people there as hostages. And so it's hard for me to think that just having US businesses in Ukraine, which will take a while, years before there are going to be large numbers of them there, even if we have some kind of ceasefire, is really a security guarantee. So that's the tension. The administration wants a ceasefire, maybe some confidence building measures that lead to an enduring ceasefire. Whereas the Ukrainians, want a peace settlement with security guarantees. And so far, I think the administration has said that, in addition to the mineral deal, we also, of course, will encourage the Europeans to do what they want. And they want to put in U.S. troops there. Great. We want to provide, the military and economic assistance to Ukraine. That's appropriate. Ukraine's near Europe, more closer to Europe than it is to the U.S. But you're right. We've seen a lot of enticements given to Russia, a lot of threats and coercion given to Ukraine. Perhaps they're trying to redress about imbalance they saw with the previous administration. Biden, it was all punishing Russia and helping Ukraine, and I think President Trump might think that is not not in the best position he can be to sort of force an agreement between the two parties.
So, before I move to the next topic, just another point there to ask about the Russian and the Ukrainian negotiations in the US. So we know from the first administration, Trump basically is not afraid to take polemic topics, and we saw that with North Korea. And one of the biggest issue was that the North Korean basically kind of kicked the ball and said, we don't want that, even though massive concessions on behalf of the Trump administration. And we see him now doing something very similar, kind of taking a pariah state at this moment, which is Russia, and engaging with them, not so much worried about the implications of just the engagement. So we know that he doesn't care so much about the reputation of engagement with pariah states as far as making a deal. Everything can be discussed in a room, kind of the whole deal making approach. So if the Russians are going to miss this opportunity, so I'm going here for a scenario. If the Russia are gonna do the what now is not being discussed, but they're going to miss the opportunity and they're going to give up on these wonderful offers that Trump is giving. What will be the ramifications for the Russian-U.S. relations? Because we know with North Korea, it didn't kind of explode it, but in the end of the day, nothing really changed. Will that be the end of the game for Russia-U.S. relations renaissance, are we saying, or will that be something that you think the administration will try to revive?
Right. So if the Russia-US reconciliation fails at present, it looks like we'll just go back to where we were because the Europeans aren't following along, except with a few minor exceptions. But if the European probably under new leadership, maybe, National Front in France or, AfD in Germany or some other party comes in and willing to reconcile, then it might be more difficult to reverse. So, the US can offer sanctions relief, but to you, Russia, but it probably won't really matter just because the economic opportunities are limited. But if the Europeans start rolling back their sanctions, that would really benefit Russia. But for now, as I said, I think the enticements are reversible. I don't think we'll see a major gain for Russia if this fails, this outreach effort fails.
So I want to move. You talk about the Europeans. I want to talk a little bit more about the NATO alliance. We're seeing here a fundamental approach that has, in a way, kind of contradiction in it. On the one hand, we have a request to increase the budget to 5%, to increase the defense budget to 5% of the overall budget of those European countries, member of NATO. What everybody are saying, fair enough. I hear that from all across the board. Is like, yeah, they were too late to the party for many years now. You know, the check is here. Somebody needs to start paying for the defense umbrella, and the U.S. is right in us in that. But on the other hand, is making direct challenges to sovereignty of NATO members, such as Denmark when it comes to Greenland, or challenging their policy when it comes to Ukraine, or challenging domestically within internal politics when it comes to Germany and the AfD and the whole Vance approach and speech that he gave in the Munich conference. I'm not even talking about Elon Musk and his support. So this is kind of a contradictory approach that we see. And on the one hand, you're asking for more in terms of budget increasement, in terms of taking more responsibility of your own defense and security. On the other hand, literally kind of setting up an approach which is very aggressive. It's been seen as aggressive by those European allies. So, how do you see this NATO dynamics going in the near future when it comes to Trump administration and their policy towards NATO?
Yes, this is an unexpected feature of Trump in his second term, at least unexpected by me, this sort of grand imperial design. Well, I want Canada, I want Panama, I want Greenland, I want Europe to change its domestic policies. So I had anticipated this. It might be that this is now President Trump's vision, as you were suggesting in the beginning, sort of great power world US, most powerful country. Let's take advantage of that hegemon status to exploit other countries, gain concessions, and that will keep us the hegemon. It may be tactical. You frighten these countries so enough that they'll make more concessions. Europeans will spend more in defense. Other countries will change their trade policies. But it is unusual that President Trump has adopted this kind of vocabulary because he didn't do it his first term to any great extent.
So let me touch on that moving forward with NATO before we move to the tariffs. What is the future of NATO when we see this? I mean,
Right.
it seems that it's very vague.
Yeah, as far as I can see, NATO is going to persist. The administration won't withdraw. Their ambassador designate to NATO was just had his confirmation hearings yesterday, and the idea of withdrawing from NATO didn't really come up. So I think what they're going to do is try and get the Europeans to take charge of European security. U.S. might keep some troops in some favorite countries like Poland, but basically they want the Europeans to step up, take charge of European defense. And the Europeans will say they were willing to do this, but we'll have to see.
So let's move to US, EU slash Canada slash Mexico. And I'm keeping China for last, but let's talk about the tariffs. What's the logic behind that? From an international relations, geopolitical perspective, not from an economic, theoretical side of things, but what is it that Trump is trying to achieve the geopolitical side of things, when he's approaching countries which are strong allies of the United States, like Canada, or strong trading partner like Mexico, and basically out of nowhere imposes those tariffs on them, and and knowing that this will cost him also domestically in terms of how it will impact the economy. So there's a geopolitical thinking behind it. What is he trying to achieve with it?
Right. I say I don't think you can break it down that way. I don't think it sees it geopolitically. I really does think he does see this as economic. So in his view, the US has been cheated economically with these trade imbalances. If you put in tariffs, you're going to force industries to come back to the US to rather than, we've seen a lot of companies invest in Mexico to circumvent US tariffs. Well, now if you force them to invest in the US, he seems to think that it'll benefit the US economically, bring in revenue to the Treasury, bring in jobs. His spokespeople have been saying, well, yes, we might have a short-term spurt of inflation, but it'll in the long term, our deregulation, increased energy production, and other measures are going to reduce inflation. So it'll be negated as largely happened the first term, even though the situation is different second term. So I really the geopolitical costs are extraordinary. The Canadians have overnight become incredibly hostile. It looked like a pro-Trump candidate was going to win the Canadian elections, head of Conservatives. Now that's entirely flipped, and the Canadians are rallying around the Liberals who are more independent from the U.S., at least from Trump. So the geopolitical logic is all would argue against doing anything like this. So apparently it's driven by his economic beliefs on, what's fair for the US, what will benefit the US economy. And, most economists disagree. They think it will lead to increased inflation, potentially even a recession, certainly trade diversion and other challenges to the US going forward.
There's a question from the audience here, and I think it's kind of related to that. So I want to connect the points. So the question from Adrian is, how is U.S. foreign policy adapting to the challenges and opportunities presented by emerging technologies, AI, cybersecurity, space, and so on? And I want to connect that to the topic of tariffs, because it seems that a lot of the aspect here is control over the manufacturing of those new emerging technologies, the control over supply chains, and control over the ability to control the source of the technology for various reasons, and the fear of China controlling them also. And it seems that that kind of a thing, that they're looking ahead into the technological race, is what leading a lot of the policy when it comes to tariffs. So bringing in production and manufacturing into the U.S., Greenland for minerals and so on, and also the Arctic and so on. So where do you see that kind of a combination of how the technological race is impacting the foreign policy doctrine?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. That Canada and Greenland are very valuable as rare earth minerals. That's certainly something we've seen President Trump focus in on Ukraine. Um, the AI semiconductor spurt we saw yesterday with him touting new investments from Apple and Taiwan and Taiwanese companies. The previous administration had similar objectives, just used different tools. So they weren't trying to use tariffs to force the investment. They were just trying to make the U.S. more attractive through the CHIP Act, though we saw President Trump announce that last night. Um, Another change apparently is deregulation. So we know that the Biden administration is very concerned about AI safety issues, uh, concerns about existential risk, risk of discrimination, unemployment disruption. So they were trying to work on that. Whereas it seems that this administration is going to relax the regulation, rely on the private sector to drive AI as fast as possible and make sure the benefits outweigh any potential setbacks.
And when does it come to, and now I'm jumping to the topic of China, when it comes to this technological race with China, how much do you think of the decisions that are being made today are basically targeting China specifically as the end goal here, which is essentially kind of a zero-sum game. So it's not necessarily about the US profiting so much as they don't want the Chinese to advance as much as they are. Like the scare of China technological advancements, as we saw with DeepSeek and so on, is what really is kind of pushing this administration to take some of those decisions on their foreign policy.
Right. So China and Iran are sort of the two mysteries here, or at least they're two most uncertain, because we haven't really seen major initiatives regarding China or Iran yet. We've seen a lot of focus on economic punishment, tariffs. Current administration is continuing the policy of trying to could discourage other countries from giving China the most advanced chips or equipment, and so that stayed constant because it's seen as such an important sector. The U.S. wants to stay ahead. What is missing in the China front, which we haven't, is that many of the people in administration are strong China hawks, and not only economically, but also ideologically. We saw in the first administration a lot of senior people, including Vice President Pence, constantly attack the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, as a malign ideological force. We really haven't seen that yet in administration speak. In addition, the military component, we thought that there'd be a major effort to strengthen U.S. defenses in the Pacific, pull, forces from Europe and the Middle East there, allocate more resources. We haven't really seen major military initiatives in the Pacific. Continuation of previous policies, freedom navigation, exercises with key partners, but nothing really new. So that's a bit of a mystery. So far, the economics, as you described, but similar to the previous administration. But we're sort of missing the understanding of what's the ideological and military component of U.S.-China relations going forward. Perhaps President Trump's trying to keep his options open for a deal, some kind of broad deal with the Chinese, but we just can't tell yet. Nothing's new.
I think it's one of those things that it's also we kind of tend to forget we're only 2 months, not even 2 months into this administration. So there's still things to follow. This has been a very accelerated pace of events and of decisions and actions, but not something that has been taking place for a long time. So when it comes to China, how much do you think is this administration, as you mentioned, there's a lot of hawks, Rubio, Walls, as you mentioned, and so on. How much is it that this administration is ready and willing to be on the compromising side of things and reaching kind of sorts of a settlement? Because we see on the Chinese side of things, the message we're getting is keep calm and keep on going, no drama, no sudden actions. Let's see where this is going. And there's a lot of back channel stuff we don't know, but apparently are also taking place. So where do you think this administration is basically taking this with China?
Right. So it's basically up to President Trump. China policy is something he's going to take charge of, and all these other people, China hawks and so on, will fall into line. Um, and he's made some negative comments about China in terms of tariffs and investment, but he's made some positive comments. He says he's hoping to talk and work with Xi. He wants to engage with China in arms control and nuclear and conventional and open to a deal. So it's really up to President Trump to decide to what extent he wants to try and deal with China. I mean, he's been very focused first initially on Israel and Gaza, and then on Ukraine and Russia, as well as a major domestic issues. But at some point, we're expecting him to turn to China, and then it'll be clear. But basically, it's up to him. I mean, so I wouldn't whatever the other people say. I'd take it into account, but it's really something he's going to decide.
If you're sitting now in Taipei and you're seeing Trump and his policy towards Ukraine, and you're seeing the recent visit of Trump, he made a visit to Japan, where he made a statement about basically also that some there were I saw two type of explanation about that statement. One that he's committed to the status quo, so he will support Taiwan as long as it's committed to the status quo, i.e., not declaring independence. But then the other that is also committed to the idea of corrosion is not something that will be standing by anymore, meaning that is kind of upgrading his level of risk that he's not willing to take with the Chinese, with those what you call gray zone tactics, the ongoing incursions into Taiwanese airspace and naval incursions and so on. So if you're sitting in Taipei right now and you're trying to understand, will the administration be there on D-Day of the Chinese blockade slash invasion slash whatever action they choose? Are you more relaxed or are you more nervous from what we're seeing so far?
I would be a bit more nervous because whereas President Biden on multiple occasions reversed the longstanding policy of ambiguity and said that the US, if the Chinese attempted a military operation like Russia did in Ukraine, just out and out try and seize Taiwan through military means, then he would tell the US military to intervene to stop it. President Trump hasn't said that. He's going back to the traditional policy of ambiguity. Maybe the US will intervene, maybe it won't. But he really hasn't focused in on that issue. And then on the semiconductor side, he seems eager to pull, Taiwanese investment into the US, which, may help Taiwan in the short term, but long term, it sort of undermines their silicon shield strategy. So, you know, right now the thinking is you can't, have to defend Taiwan because its silicon factories are just so important for the world economy, and that's going to deter the Chinese as well. But if that production capacity is more globally dispersed, then you can, then the risk of Taiwan falling under Chinese control or being destroyed in a war somewhat declines, at least in that economic, semiconductor sector.
When you look into this Asia Pacific policy of this administration, we saw under Biden, the I would say the administration was very focused on strengthening alliances. Philippines, Japan, uh, Taiwan. I mean, Nancy Pelosi visit was there was no alliance there, but definitely the commitment at least in the visit and so on. If this administration look at the pivot to Asia that Obama started, so to speak, and want to continue that, where will they focus on? Will it be economic? Will it be about strengthening their grip with Japan? Where do you see this administration going when it comes to relations with the Asia Pacific countries, specifically Japan, Philippines, and Korea?
Yeah, I'd throw Australia and India into that too. So a bit of a mystery because they haven't made any major initiatives. They haven't changed previous policies, as I said, slight change in rhetoric about Taiwan, but the military engagement with Korea and Japan continues. The US forces are there. AUKUS continues with Australia, India. They're still trying to work on pulling India against China. So I haven't seen really major changes yet. President Trump has said that he wants the South Koreans and Japanese to pay more for hosting U.S. troops. There's a possibility because he said that yesterday in his presentation in his speech to Congress that they may impose reciprocal tariffs on South Korea next month. I think it's April 2nd is the date they might do it. But no major initiatives yet in Asia. As I said, we saw Middle East be the focus the first few weeks and then Europe. So we're all waiting to see this when they focus on Asia, what are they going to do? So far, there's been no major breaks. We think there'll be more economic pressure. Big mystery is the military. Will they continue the policy of strengthening military ties, being overtly anti-China and so on, or are they gonna try for something else?
So, last but not least, let's talk about that region of the world, the Middle East. We're seeing a kind of I would say, a little bit of a silence. And I don't know if it's a silence before the storm or is it because they're really the administration is working on the back channels? We know that they're involving the Russians to maybe to take a more of a mediator approach when it comes to Iran. So this is an administration that on their basically in the days following the elections, but also in the campaigns, they were talking about maximum pressure, restoring maximum pressure, the sanctions that they're looking into, but also a more aggressive maximum pressure when it comes to Iran and the nuclear program and so on. And Iran is in a very vulnerable position, never seen before for decades. So it seems as if the accumulation of events and accumulation of the of the actors' actions will lead to kind of a maximum pressure that will aim to break down the Iranian regime and to kind of impose on them a nuclear sanctions or a nuclear agreement that will be basically forbidding them from a nuclear option and so on and so on. That's not happening. We're not seeing none of that. So my question to you: where are we seeing the U.S. policy when it comes to Iran? Is it really engaging now as kind of a last, last attempt of diplomacy before the big guns are rolling, or is it part of an ideology of let's not confront, let's make a deal?
All right. So again, that like China, it's a bit of a mystery. So we've seen uh, it stepped up as far as we can tell on sanctions enforcement, discouraging countries from buying Iranian oil, but nothing, major break. Um, so far, the Middle East, as we know, is focused on getting the hostages back in Gaza. But so the administration came in and pushed. I think we could say that obviously Witkoff pushed the first phase of the Biden three-phase framework across the finish line. So the Israeli government agreed to that. But even the administration, they're somewhat ambiguous about phases 2 and 3. This is a Biden idea. Trump's been toying around with alternative solutions for Gaza. Um, Witkoff has been dual, obviously multi-hatted. They've been using him in Ukraine, they've been using him in Israel and others. So he might just be overwhelmed staff-wise and hasn't had time to focus on Iran, or it could be we're still waiting for that policy. But for now, it's been nothing major. You're right. So more sanctions enforcement, Houthis going back to the terrorist list. Nothing new about Syria, really. And just sort of monitor that. Continue counterterrorism operations, but still uncertainty whether U.S. troops will remain in Syria or even Iraq going forward. So we're still waiting on final policies to the Middle East beyond Israel and Palestine and Lebanon. Arguably, they were active there. Um, but that in China, Chinese Asia are the bit of a mystery. I think President Trump says he wants to reach a nuclear deal with Iran. So arguably, if the Iranians can persuade him that they're not going to go for a nuclear weapon and offer verifiable means to enforce that, he might be willing to compromise on other issues. I imagine the Israeli government has their own ideas about what to do. Some of them I find rather odd, like letting the Russians keep a base in Syria. I think it's a really bad idea. I think the US should try and avert that if at all possible, because that Syria base is a means by which Russia's been projecting influence throughout much of Africa. So I'd like to get them out of there, if possible. But on Iran, not yet clear. I mean, we'll have to. It's just uncertain. You're right. Iran's in a vulnerable position in some ways because its partners are weaker, but relations with Russia are a bit stronger. Certainly, they've made a lot more progress on the nuclear front. They're more able to develop a nuclear weapons. How you balance that out? I think we're just waiting. What's the Iran policy going to be?
So you mentioned a little bit the Israeli angle. Just for those of us who don't know, there was a negotiation for a ceasefire agreement, hostages, and the release of prisoners, and Israeli withdrawal from some certain areas within Gaza. That was phase one. There's phase 2 and 3, which are being discussed, but nothing is being agreed. And basically, it's a kind of a 50-50 coin toss. Is it a restoration into, are we going to see a back into fighting, or continuation of phase one, or beginning of phase two of the deal? Each one of those phases, I'm not going to go into those, are different in aspect. Um, it seems the U.S. administration is fully supporting whatever the Israeli government is basically wanting to do. So it seems that, unlike in the case of Ukraine, where the U.S. administration is forcing its will, and unlike with the Biden administration holding back on some weapon deliveries to Israel, the Trump administration is showing a different approach, which is essentially you lead and we basically give you the support you need diplomatically and militarily. Or is it that the U.S. is actually looking for a different type of solution there when it comes to Gaza?
I think that would be a great topic for a separate Wikistrat seminar because you've got a deep bench of Middle East experts and as I say, at this point, Iran policy, phase two, it's all a bit uncertain, Iraq, Syria. But I think some of your team of experts I know have really deep insights into what they think the administration would do. So I think that might be a question to deal in your next seminar with when you get your whole team together on that.
All right, so we have a question from the audience because I think we cover half the globe. I mean, we didn't go into Arctic and Africa and Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela. We're not going to go there. We only
Mm.
have 1 hour. But there's a question here from the audience. I actually like this one because it's a very interesting one. So let me read it out to you. How do you feel about the statement that the U.S. foreign policy is being driven by two things right now? First, obvious hotspots conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza, and low-hanging fruits. So, for example, strong economic pressures against non-antagonistic countries highly exposed to reliant on U.S. economic relationship, i.e., countries that need the U.S. And are reliant on it. So, how would you say this? How would you react to this statement?
Yeah, I mean, being driven by crises is not unusual. Arguably that was the Biden administration, the Bush administration. I mean, basically everybody comes in with their own plans, and then reality and crises displace them. So you could argue, yes, they're doing it. I think though it's a bit more proactive. They had choices on which hotspots to deal with, and they really focused in on Israel and Palestine and Russia, Ukraine as their highest priorities, foreign policy wise. The picking on weaker countries that can't strike back economically. I mean, President Trump seems open to confronting everybody economically. We're seeing, I think we'll see that clear next month with reciprocal tariffs. What's a bit of a mystery is how long this will continue. Is it just temporary tactical? I think most people didn't expect him to institute the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico just because it was seen as not needed because they were making concessions in other areas and perhaps economically just too disruptive. It'd be hard to reverse. So I think, it's partly reacting to hotspots, but I think they are trying to be proactive. What's unusual is we haven't seen policies on major issues like Iran and China yet developed. Um, and so, that's I think is I'm puzzled to yet draw great, broad sweeping assessments of where the administration is going to go because there are just some holes in that framework that we need to have filled to get a better sense of what's going to happen.
Two last questions. The first, and we only have 4 minutes, so let me ask you. The first one that we received via email was, "What is the Trump administration policy towards USID, and what is it driven? What is it driven by?"
Um, as far as we can see, they're just trying to kill that agency. I think that uh, in a narrow sense, a lot of the policies that were pursued in the previous administration, the current administration is ideologically opposed to, and Trump rolled off a whole bunch of them last night in his State of the Union speech. People are encouraged to review that if they're interested in the cases. But there is some speculation that it was sort of a trial. They want to start, going after bigger agencies like Department of Education and USAID was a very easy picking. It's does foreign aid, which isn't particularly popular, doesn't have strong constituencies in the U.S. And so you could experiment how you can kill a somewhat large agency, but not something that can provoke a lot of domestic resistance. And now that you've tried it, the courts have ruled on what you can and cannot do. You can now see how you can go after some of the bigger agencies like Department of Education.
And just because we're in the final minutes, kind of concluding remarks, where is this administration going? I mean, what's next? And I know this is probably the most difficult question,
Right,
but what's next for this administration? Is it going to be declaring war in Greenland?
right,
I mean, it's a joke of saying that, but the
right.
point is, how much are we going to see of this kind of a momentum of so many events, so many actions, so much taking place in terms of the intensity of the policies and the
Right.
clashes, and there's one thing you can say about this administration and Trump. They're not afraid of clash and they're not afraid of bad reviews and critique. So, how much? I mean, the bottom line here is where is this is going? Where do you see this is going in the near future?
Right. So in the near term, it looks like they're going to focus on Ukraine and perhaps Gaza, just getting those nailed down. They want to start the peace talks in Ukraine, ideally get a ceasefire. And Gaza, as you said, we're at a precipice, so they're going to have to. It's going to force some kind of policy on them. Um, but longer term, they may want to. It's a bit of a mystery because we don't have the China factor peg really nailed down yet. So they apparently, want to improve relations with Russia and China, try and break them apart, try and reduce tensions, manage that competition better, where and force allies and partners to make concessions in other areas. But whether I can't, I'm hesitant to say that until I know what their China policy is going to be. And I think you can see a lot of obstacles to their realizing their objectives. And when they encounter, if they're not able to accomplish what they want, what are they going to do next? Trump did show himself very flexible first term. Even seen this term. He had an idea for Gaza, he threw it out. He tried to get people to sign on, they didn't. So he backed off and said, "All right, I'm willing to entertain alternative perspectives." So he can be flexible on some of these issues, and I think this is one of them. On an overall foreign policy. I think he's going to be, it's hard to predict they're going to go because he is tactically so flexible.
Okay, so with that, we're going to conclude this webinar. Richard, thank you so much. This has been both insightful and a lot of fun also to discuss this topic. We pretty much cover, like they used to say about the British Empire, the sun never goes down on the British Empire, right? But so in the sense here, we covered a lot of topics, most of them, at the end of the day, open. We still don't know. We're still kind of trying to figure out, but it was super interesting. A lot of good questions also from the crowd. So I want to thank everybody who joined us for this webinar. I want to thank you, Richard. For those of you who missed the previous webinar we had with Andres Homeland about the German elections, it's going to be like this one posted online, as well as on our website. So this, please do follow. And in addition, we are planning a few more other webinars this coming month. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you for everybody for joining us.